We all know the Roman Empire was vast, but what was its most remote military outpost? By ancient accounts, it was a mysterious place where people dwelled in caves, where boats were made of turtle shells, and where kings were stoned for setting foot beyond their palaces. Many more fantastical stories abound, but can we locate it? There are many places one might look. For starters, we can break out a map and a ruler to measure the distances from Rome to the four corners of the empire at the time of its greatest territorial extent. But these are just linear distances. An accounting must be made of actual travel routes and travel times, which in many cases double the true distances of such locations. But that's not enough to measure remoteness. Adding further to this, we might want to take into account the military campaigns which extended beyond such territorial borders and would have installed, at least temporarily, a Roman fort bearing the imperial aquila. For even greater diligence in pursuit of our answer, we could even stretch the definition of fort to include the tiny camps which would have been pitched by soldiers on expeditions which were launched into remote regions such as the frozen north or the burning Sahara. Yet even with all of this mapped out, there's always been speculation about just how far Rome's tendrils reached. But in 2004, archaeologists found it, concrete proof of Rome's most remote outpost. The discovery came in the form of this inscription, written with pride by the soldiers of the 2nd Legion Trianafortis in 143 AD. And here's the wildest part. The location where this was found isn't even on the map we've been looking at. So today, let's dive into the history of this lost and most remote Roman fort and find out what brought them to the ends of the earth. In recent news, a new pope is in the Vatican. That means that all eyes are on Rome, not just you, me, and the other Roman nerds. But something you might have missed is actually other archaeological findings in Rome of a forgotten papal palace, which is really cool, and I would have missed it had it not been for today's sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a website and app that empowers you to be a properly informed consumer of the news. Each day, they pull in thousands of news articles from around the world and organize them by story in one place. And for each story, you'll get a visual breakdown of the story's political bias, reliability, and ownership. So with this particular papal story, around 30 sources are reporting on it. Now with traditional algorithm-based news articles, you're going to be fed the most sensational take, but Ground News allows you to engage with the material in a more informed way. So for example, here through the app, I can see that a few right-leaning sources with lower reputation are trying to grab attention using more emotive headlines like Secret and Breakthrough, while I see a couple left-leaning outlets have in fact actually restrained themselves with terms like possible. The Smithsonian, a high factuality source in the center, actually offers the most historical context, pointing out for instance that this structure is believed to have housed dozens of popes before the 1300s. So as you can see, this is a really great way to filter out the noise when it comes to headlines and really drill down to the best articles. Another one of my favorite features on Ground News is their blind spot feed, which shows you stories disproportionately covered by one side or the other. It's essential if you care about history, context, and not being misled by headlines. I honestly love Ground News and think it's one of the best platforms out there to take on in our age of misinformation. So head on over to ground.news/Invicta or scan the QR code on screen to transform how you read the news and get 40% off the unlimited access Vantage plan. That's ground.news/Invicta. For me, Ground News has been a vital part of my online life, and I know you'll enjoy it just as much as I do. So check it out. Now, before we begin, I want to say that I got a bit carried away with this episode. Often, with these more exploratory videos, I'd like to actually start broad and provide context as we wind our way towards answering the main question. So in this case, that'll include chapters on the following: measuring remoteness, the discovery, background on the region's geography, background on the region's history, a journey to the outpost, and life at the outpost. It's a long one for sure, which will be ideal for just kicking back and listening in podcast style. But if you want to jump straight to the chase, please use the timestamps on screen and in the description below. With that being said, let's get started. Locating Rome's most remote outpost can be a bit trickier than expected. Knowing when, where, and what to look for isn't always clear. For our purposes though, we'll be seeking to identify the location of a fort, garrisoned by soldiers of the imperial era, which is furthest away from the city of Rome. To this end, there are numerous ways we might go about searching for and qualifying the potential candidates. One method would be to pull up a map of Rome at its greatest territorial extent. As you can see, this puts us roughly in the year 117 AD. It is here, under the reign of Emperor Trajan, that the frontiers have well and truly been pushed to the extremes. So let's now take out a ruler and measure to the edges. From near to far, we have the following. The northernmost fort along the Germanic border is 1,300 kilometers away. After this, you have Mauritania at 1,900, Britannia at 2,000, the Bosporan border at 2,200, Egypt's border at 2,700, Armenia's border at 3,000, and Mesopotamia's border at 3,400 kilometers away. Here's a graphic we'll be using to log the data for our various locations. Already, these distances are formidable, and among them, we can see that the edge of Mesopotamia is the most remote, at least as the crow flies. But now we have to account for more realistic travel routes and times from Rome to each location. To this end, I've actually used this awesome Orbis web tool to gauge route itineraries. The website is fantastic and lets you actually break things down by season, by travel type, and more. So for instance, we can plot a trip to the British frontier. Orbis tells me that, quote, the fastest journey from Rome to Lugvalium in July takes 30.9 days, covering 3,502 kilometers. On top of this, I've added an extra 240 kilometers and 1.6 days by boat to get us to the westernmost part of the Antonine Wall. Here's what our travel map now looks like when we account for these more realistic travel routes to all of our destinations. Things are truly much more daunting. For quantitative comparison, I've updated our graph from before. As you can see, all the figures have jumped up significantly. Germania's distances more than double, and now sits closer to the middle of the pack. Mesopotamia is still at the top, but has now been slightly edged out by Armenia's border, which is a whopping 4,600 kilometers away from Rome. As a final way to contextualize this data, we can now add on a second axis which plots the travel times associated with each of these aforementioned routes. My thinking here is that we need to account for variable travel times on roads, on rivers, and on seas. It's great for reference. Yet ultimately, the rankings are only slightly impacted. For our purposes at least, the variance does seem to now equalize Armenia and Mesopotamia to within just a few hours from one another, so basically a wash, at around 45.5 days journey from Rome. However, all of these destinations represent points along the frontier of Rome at its greatest extent. But we know that definitions of frontiers are actually quite fuzzy, and Roman military campaigns at times extended the empire's footprint beyond the 117 AD borders we have been looking at. Take for instance Germania. While the frontier ended up settling along the fixed geographic boundary of the Rhine, the Germanic wars of the early 1st century had seen troops stationed as far away as the Elbe River. Similarly, in Britannia, the legions under General Agricola had established forts up to the north of modern Scotland before eventually fortifying a more southerly frontier along Hadrian and Antonine's Wall. Across our other regions, there were similar degrees of border fuzziness. I've updated our distance graphic to account for these high water marks of Roman territory. As you can see, all of the furthest possible outposts are now extended in range. But admittedly, it's quite marginal in the grand scheme of things and doesn't much change up our rankings. Armenia and Mesopotamia still lead the pack. Now let's explore another idea. What about Roman military campaigns which tried, but failed to establish a new frontier? The best examples of this are Emperor Augustus's two often forgotten invasions of Arabia and Nubia. We've covered these in prior videos if you want to learn more. But had these actually resulted in territorial gain, the new outposts would have been among the furthest out of our data points. Other points we can consider are reports of Roman military units which ventured beyond the frontier, not for conquest, but for exploration. In such cases, we have to really stretch our definition of a Roman outpost to account for what was most likely a small campsite. Destinations which fall under this category would include records of 1st and 2nd century AD expeditions into West Sub-Saharan Africa, as well as Nero's mission to find the source of the Nile, which was reportedly tasked to a group of praetorians. We've also covered this topic in another episode if you want to learn more. If included, they likely would have taken the lead in our rankings. However, I've decided to rule them out, as we have very poor records of where they actually ended up, leading to some pretty big error bars. Furthermore, any such trips would have only resulted in small, temporary Roman camps, of which no concrete archaeology has been found, nor will likely ever be found. This now finally tees us up for the subject of our video. Given all this, what is Rome's truly most remote outpost? As you can get a sense from our graphics, the locations to beat are all in the east. This makes sense considering that the other directions are basically restricted by huge geographic barriers. Looking to the east then, we get closer to the answer. But another major barrier rears its head in the form of the Parthian and Sassanid empires, which long served as a check against Roman expansion. Indeed, it is they who profited mightily from trade along the Silk Road and took great efforts to cut out the Romans from more direct relations with the grand empires of the Far East like China. Yet there was one way to sidestep the Persians: the sea lanes which flowed out and around the Arabian Peninsula. This is precisely where archaeologists made their discovery of the most distant Roman outpost. The location, it turns out, were the Pharazan Islands, located along the southwestern shores of Saudi Arabia. They lie a whopping 4,000 linear kilometers from Rome. For context, that's the same distance as from New York City to LA, from Paris to Canada, and from Tokyo to Thailand. Truly mind-boggling scales for an empire which existed 2 millennia ago. What distinguishes it even further from other frontier outposts is that it lies truly in the middle of nowhere, being projected out well in advance of the nearest border of Egypt. But as we've discussed before, the realities of ancient travel make this distance even more expansive. From Rome, one would have to skip across the shores of the Mediterranean over to Egypt. Here, one would then hitch a ride up the Nile to the First Cataract. At this point, one would travel overland to the seaport of Berenike, before sailing a further 1,000 kilometers to the Pharazan Islands. Altogether, it's a trip of 4,640 kilometers, or 2,883 miles, which would have taken about 46 days to reach at the fastest possible. Hit a hitch in traffic, and you're now getting closer to the roughly 2-month travel time it would have taken Columbus to cross the Atlantic. Wow. But stepping back for a second, you might ask, how do we actually know that there was a Roman outpost in the Pharazans? The answer comes down to a lucky archaeological find. It's actually quite new, having first been discovered by chance in a 1981 survey of the region and subsequently only brought to light with little fanfare in 2004 during the 37th meeting of the Seminar for Arabian Studies held in London. I actually dug up the original paper here. It's a quick read, full of interesting context, which I'll link below for you to digest. But basically, the proof for Romans at the Pharazan Islands boils down to the discovery of a quite unambiguous stone block bearing Latin inscriptions. Upon translation, it reads as follows: For the Emperor Caesar Titus Aelius Hadrianus Antoninus Augustus Pius, Pontifex Maximus, in the 7th year of his tribunician authority, 3 times consul, father of his country, on behalf of the vexillation of the 2nd Legion Trianofortis and its auxiliary troops, Castricius Aprinus, Publius' son, prefect of the Portus of Pharazan and of the Sea of Hercules, has made and dedicated this monument. And there it is, the proof of Rome's furthest military outpost, dated to the year 144 AD. This is basically as good as you can hope for from an archaeological perspective, when you find a literal note listing the who, what, when, where, and why of the piece itself. Since then, further findings have been made. Shortly after the first inscription was found, a second, more damaged one that listed the letters VI and FERR. Researchers have interpreted this as signifying the presence of troops from the Legio Sixferata. Given the fact that they were briefly stationed in Arabia during Hadrian's rule, the potential earliest date of occupation might actually be moved up earlier to 119 AD. Though this comes with the caveat that the legion was moved around the region quite a lot over the ensuing decades, thus making any specific dating difficult. A later Franco-Saudi team in 2022 found additional artifacts dated to the Roman period. These include a small stone statue, a garnet bearing the name for a figure named Genos, a folded Roman shield, and pieces of lorica squamata. So now that we've established that the Romans were indeed in this most remote of outposts, we can ask, what were they doing there? As is always the case, I like to start answering such questions with a broad lay of the land. Geographically speaking, the Pharazans are a group of small coral islands just 40 kilometers off the shores of Arabia. The largest of the islands measures some 50 kilometers across and is surrounded by a gradation of smaller neighbors, many of which are 5 kilometers or less across. Today, the islands are quite arid and barren, In the past, however, they harbored more life. While we have no Roman-era descriptions of these lands, Arabic writings from the 15th century give us some idea of the conditions. The navigator Ahmad Majib reports as follows, quote, "North of the Hundasan and around it are islands having cattle and camels, palms and fruits. There are about 20 houses, and their harbor is for 1,000 ships and can be used in the Kharif monsoon in all winds. There you can find a well called Shafel, which will water 1,000 ships and not run dry." Thus we see that the Pharazans could have similarly been identified by the Romans as a suitable port and way station. But for more context on why the area might be worth actually founding an outpost upon, let's explore the wider characteristics of the Red Sea. Zooming out a bit, we notice that the Pharazans are not the only island chain. Across from it lie the Dalag Islands. To the south are the Cameron and Hanish Islands, and around the region are many other smaller formations. Their existence is owed to the nature of the Red Sea itself. Having been molded by relatively recent tectonic activity, it is overall quite shallow, at less than 100 meters measured along the extensive shelves on either shoulder of the rift, which have long proved fertile ground for the proliferation of marine life and corals. Such shallow, obstacle-strewn waters are what made passage through the Red Sea so dangerous, especially in anything but clear weather conditions. Apparently, most ancient navigators stuck to the deeper parts of the central channel. Only local experts could be relied upon to pilot ships closer to the shores, or even within the inner lanes which ran just behind the bands of coral reef. To make matters worse, the region has adversarial wind patterns caused by the elongated shape, its flanking mountain ranges, and the presence of monsoons. In the past, the Red Sea was often considered as two seas, split around the latitude of 20 degrees north. The north part of the Red Sea is dominated by persistent winds flowing towards the southeast, with speeds ranging anywhere from between 7 to 12 kilometers an hour. The rest of the Red Sea is subjected to regular and seasonally reversible winds that blow southeast in the summer and northwest in the winter. Given these conditions, ancient sailors preferred the southern half of the Red Sea, where they could time their travels with the monsoons to blow in and out of the region more efficiently on the way to further destinations in Africa, Arabia, and India. For a first-hand account of what sailing the Red Sea was like in the Roman era, we can actually quote from the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, the ancient name for the Indian Ocean. This Periplus is basically a travelogue, dated to around 60 AD, of a man who routinely traveled these waters. The relevant passage goes, quote, "Navigation is dangerous along the whole coast of Arabia, which is without harbors, with bad anchorages, foul, inaccessible because of breakers and rocks, and terrible in every way. Therefore, we hold our course down the middle of the Gulf, and pass on as fast as possible by the country of Arabia, until we have come to the Burnt Island, directly below which there are regions of peaceful people, nomadic, pastures of cattle, sheep, and camels." As you can see, the passage confirms much of the geographic troubles we have been discussing. Interestingly though, it makes no mention of the Pharazan Islands as part of the Red Sea journey. To see why they eventually come into the picture though, let's now turn to the history of trade and Roman involvement in the region. Trade along the Red Sea dates back millennia to the Bronze Age period. Over the years, successive empires showed interest in the region, particularly as a means to link the worlds of the Mediterranean, the Near East, and India. In the Hellenic period, the Ptolemies of Egypt were particularly keen to exploit their access to the Red Sea. This came in the form of new commercial contacts, infrastructure, and administrative positions. Several important ports were founded upon the Red Sea, with linkages back across the desert to the Nile. The two most prominent, founded around 275 BC in Upper Egypt, were Myos Hermos and Berenike. Such investments proved key to unlocking the potential for Red Sea trade. However, for a time, the Ptolemaic sailors were limited in their range, relying on intermediaries to bring in goods from further abroad. Yet the ancient historian Posidonius claims that by the late 2nd century BC, the Greeks had themselves learned how to use the monsoons to make the long journey to India and back. Such direct trade increased profit margins and fostered more commercial activity. When the Romans took over Egypt in 30 BC, they inherited this burgeoning route. The relative stability which resulted from the Pax Romana had a great stimulative effect on trade, not just within the Mediterranean basin, but also with foreign markets. The Red Sea merchants were beneficiaries of this trend in globalization, and a range of evidence indicates that trade began to increase significantly through the 1st century AD. Indeed, the historian Strabo makes the following observation. Quote, "In his day, 120 vessels sailed regularly from Egypt to India, whereas previously, very few made the journey." Further descriptions from our sources attest to the incredibly diverse nature of goods making their way through the Red Sea. These included African gold, silver, and ivory, Roman glass and metalwork, Arabian frankincense and aromatics, Indian pepper, pearls, and precious stones, Sri Lankan cinnamon and spices, Chinese silks and porcelain, and much, much more. With such tremendous wealth, there was an obvious incentive for the state to become involved. As had occurred with the Ptolemies, the Romans now stepped in to enforce customs controls and taxation. Red Sea trade in the following 2nd century AD maintained much of its prior continuity, though some evidence suggests a partial decline in trade volumes. This may have resulted from the rise of competing trade routes and the predation of other groups which sought to take their own cut of the lucrative merchant traffic. Indeed, we hear that piracy became a large issue in the area. This was exacerbated by the geography of the Red Sea we have previously discussed. It was a narrow channel with many treacherous coral reefs and islands from which raiders could quickly emerge to strike before darting back into safety. Something had to be done. This is where the Roman outpost at the Pharazôn Islands likely comes in. As might be expected, prior to the establishment of a position at the Pharazôn Islands, the Romans already had a regional military system in place. Legions were stationed in Egypt, with detachments routinely garrisoned along the Upper Nile to safeguard from attacks by the Nubians and other raiders. These would have been assisted by auxiliary units and local forces. Some naval presence was also likely active, though from what scant records we have, its nature was none too impressive, consisting mostly of a few small ships, which were probably holdovers from the Ptolemaic days. Administering all this would have been the provincial governor of Egypt. In the early 1st century, he would have been able to call upon the support of 3 legions. However, by the 2nd century AD, this count had dwindled as there were massive troop redeployments in the wake of Trajan's campaigns into Dacia and Persia. Once the emperor had finished these conquests though, it seems he turned at least some of his attentions to strengthening the Red Sea. Under his reign, the Old Pharaoh's Canal, an ancient version of the Suez Canal, was reconstructed. The author Eutropius reports further that, quote, "He also fitted out a fleet for the Red Sea, that he might use it to lay waste to the coasts of India." Thus, we have some clues here that Trajan may have been responsible for increased military investment in the Red Sea. We don't know exactly their purpose, but likely a pressing concern would have been to combat piracy and to establish outposts which could be used for future military campaigns, as is suggested by some later authors. The process would have taken some time for planning and construction, with the scope of the initiative changing over the years as successors took the throne. The earliest we can date the Romans to the Pharazons would have been around 119 AD, when troops from Legio VI Ferrata, whose name seems to appear on the islands, were deployed to nearby Arabia during the reign of Hadrian. If this connection can be drawn, then we might speculate that the Pharazons at this point were administratively a part of the Arabian province. Yet things would soon change. Our second archaeological record for Romans at the Pharazons dates some 50 years later to 144 AD, with troops from Legio II Triana Fortis, which had recently been given the posting of Egypt. Thus it seems that the Pharazons had now been administratively transferred from Arabia to this western province. Furthermore, our inscription makes mention of a Christitius Doprinus, prefect of the Portus of Pharazon and of the Sea of Hercules. Here we see that not only had a fort been erected, but it was part of a special administrative region, similar to the one found in the nearby port prefecture of Berenike. We should also note that the Sea of Hercules here seems to be the name given to the southern Red Sea. An interesting mythical parallel to the Pillars of Hercules in the West Mediterranean, which gave way to the Atlantic. Having established the origins of the outpost, we can now discuss what it would have been like for a soldier to be posted there. Let's begin with their arrival. Journey to the fort was characterized by the route we previously described. Going up the Nile from the legionary base at the Delta, over to the port of Berenike, then across the seas to the Pharazons. Here, Strabo gives some colorful descriptions of what one might encounter along the way. Quote, "At the bottom of the bay is situated the city of Berenike. After the bay is the island of Ophiades, so called from the accidental circumstance of it having once been infested with serpents. It was cleared of the serpents by the king on account of the destruction occasioned by those noxious animals to the persons who frequented the island, and on account of the topazes found there. Next, after this island, follow many tribes of fish-eaters and nomads. Then succeeds the harbor of the goddess of Sotera, the Preserver, which had its name from the circumstances of the escape and preservations of some masters of vessels from great dangers by sea. After this, the coast and the Gulf seem to undergo a great change, for the voyage along the coast is no longer among rocks and approaches almost close to Arabia. The sea is so shallow as to be scarcely the depth of 2 orgre, and has the appearance of a meadow, in consequence of the seaweeds which abound in the passage, being visible through and under the water. Even trees here grow from under the water, and the sea abounds with sea dogs. Many hunting grounds for elephants and obscure cities and islands lie in front of the coast. The greater part are nomads, while husbandmen are few in number. In the country occupied by some of these nations, Striax grows in large quantities. The fish-eaters, on the ebbing of the tide, collect fish, which they cast upon the rocks and dry in the sun. When they have well broiled them, the bones are piled in heaps, and the flesh trodden with the feet is made into cakes, which are again exposed to the sun and used as food. In bad weather, when fish cannot be produced, the bones of which they made heaps are pounded, made into cakes and eaten, but they suck the fresh bones. Some also live upon shellfish when they are fattened, which is done by throwing them into holes in standing pools of the sea, where they are supplied with small fish and used as food when other fish are scarce. To this end, they have various kinds of places for preserving and feeding fish, from whence they derive their supply. Some of the inhabitants of that part of the coast, which is without water, go inland every 5 days, accompanied by all their families with songs and rejoicings, to the watering places, where, throwing themselves on their faces, they drink as beasts until their stomachs are distended like a drum. They then return again to the sea coast. They dwell in caves or cabins with roofs consisting of beams and rafters made of the bones and spines of whales and covered with branches of the olive tree. The turtle eaters live under the cover of shells of turtles, which are large enough to be used as boats. Some make of the seaweed, which is thrown up in large quantities, lofty and hill-like heaps which are hollowed out and underneath which they live. They cast out the dead, which are carried away by the tide, as food for fish. There are also 3 islands which follow in succession: the island of tortoises, the island of seals, and the island of hawks. Along the whole coast, there are plantations of palm trees, olive trees, and laurels, not only within, but in a great part also without the straits. Strabo goes on to describe more aspects of the people, animal, and places along the Red Sea. It's a fascinating read, but for now we can jump ahead to the arrival at the Ferzans. Presumably, it had a port and dock facility, which would have been accompanied by a fort in the manner of the other desert outposts we see in remote regions of Arabia and Egypt. So that being said, what did soldiers do once they got situated? The troop posting at the Ferzan Islands may have been associated with new military offensives in the region. Evidence for this comes from the mid-2nd century orator Aelius Aristides. He writes of contemporary wars at the edges of the empire, including one that, quote, made an end to the misery of the peoples at the Red Sea who are unable to enjoy the blessings of the present. But exactly who was being targeted is unknown. Perhaps it was some of the larger regional powers like the Axumites or Himyarites. More likely, though, would have been the local pirates and traders which hailed from the smaller tribes that dotted the region. Here, the earlier Periplus leaves us with a description of these peoples. Quote, many tribes inhabit the country, differing in their speech, some partially and some altogether. The land next to the sea is similarly dotted here and there with caves of the fish-eaters, but the country inland is peopled by rascally men speaking 2 languages who live in villages and nomadic camps, by whom those sailing of the middle course are plundered, and those surviving shipwrecks are taken for slaves. Beyond this, we have very little evidence of further activity in the Ferzans explicitly. Presumably, soldiers would have gone about regular duties of such outposts, namely, maintaining the facilities and acting as policemen and customs agents. In their off time, perhaps troops would have been free to wander the island, fishing, swimming, and taking in the sights. In the modern day, it is these attractions which have made the area a tourist destination. But it's not so sure how enjoyable it would have been to be stuck in such a place for months on end, especially 2,000 years ago before the advent of air conditioning, refrigeration, and sunscreen. Making matters worse, the remoteness of the location meant that there were few opportunities to truly get off base and visit a local spa, inn, or brothel. Perhaps some shore leave was granted to visit the lands of neighboring Arabia, such as the villages and cities of the Kingdom of Himyar. Yet, just how much interaction was present is up to speculation. Given the overwhelming likelihood of boredom at such remote postings, the most interesting times of day would have been when ships came into port, bearing exotic peoples, goods, and stories from afar. Apparently, there was even a local practice of bringing aboard marines to protect ships from pirate attacks. If this Roman garrison engaged in such practices, then perhaps the troops here stood a chance of venturing into the further beyond. Maybe, just maybe, this meant making it all the way to India, alongside the most adventurous merchants. It's at this point that we might wonder what ultimately became of the outposts at the Pharazons. Unfortunately, we have few records to provide any concrete timeline. Speculation is once more warranted. For starters, we can point out that the latter half of the 2nd century marked the beginning of turbulent times. Around 165 AD, the Antonine Plague spread across the lands, devastating the empire and wreaking havoc on commercial activity. Further instability in the crisis of the 3rd century greatly undermined the Pax Romana, further weakening the once prosperous trade routes, though admittedly its severity is difficult to quantify. Despite this downswing, the Romans still had an interest in controlling Red Sea trade and projecting their influence into southern Arabia over the following centuries. This might mean a continued reason for the Pharazon outpost to be maintained. Indeed, their utility as a staging point for force projection would have been key as the Eastern Romans and Axumites engaged in proxy wars with non-Christian, pro-Persian factions over control of Himyar. Ultimately though, the pendulum would swing in the other direction with the rise of the Sassanids, who in 570 AD had enough strength to invade the region and bring it firmly into their zone of control. It is at this point that we can likely conclude that any Roman presence on the Pharazons would have been wiped away. But the strategic value of this location was not lost to the ages. Other peoples seeking to dominate the Red Sea would find use in its sheltered bays and freshwater wells. But for now, this is where our story ends. I hope you've appreciated this deep dive into the history of this most remote of Roman outposts and the surrounding context of Red Sea trade, which I find fascinating. If you like this episode, be sure to like and subscribe for more content, and check out these other related videos. See you in the next one.